This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Simone Sweeney. I'm an executive and leadership coach following a 25-year career leading high-performing teams in companies like Apple and the Lego Group. In this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to experts, coaches, and thought leaders as we make the case for why the future of great leadership is human. Discover how coaches are working to bring about a seismic change in how we define an incredible leader. We'll also consider the role of people versus technology and discuss why it's more important than ever to harness skills like self-awareness, communication, and gratitude, amongst others. In this series, our aim is to explore the very human capabilities and behaviors that will inspire a revolution in leadership and change the face of business. On today's episode of The Future of Leadership is Human, I'm thrilled to welcome the psychologist and author of emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman, to the podcast. Dan hardly needs an introduction. He's one of Wall Street Journal's top 10 most influential business thinkers, and his books and articles will be familiar to many. Dan first made emotional intelligence a household concept in the mid-1990s, and his thought leadership and programs have made emotional intelligence a critical focus for businesses around the world. I'm very excited to have him share his expertise and thoughts on how EI and the competencies of self-awareness, self-management, empathy, and social skills can make us all better leaders. Dan, welcome, and please tell our listeners a little bit about your focus and passions these days.
Hi, Simone. I'm happy to be here. I've just published a new book called Optimal about how organizations, particularly with the help of coaches, I would like to say, can help people perform at their best. I think that's extremely important. I think this is why we'll always need humans as leaders. Even with the onslaught of AI, I wouldn't trust a business's decisions to be handed over to AI. I want a person who's experienced. I want a coach who's experienced. And it's the human aspects of leadership that matter the most.
Fantastic. I'm really looking forward to getting properly stuck into the new book, and I'm sure it will be a great resource for so many and transformative as all of your writings have been going back decades. And looking back over the years, emotional intelligence has become a concept that is familiar, I think, universally. But what does it actually mean when we say emotional intelligence?
Well, I think of emotional intelligence as having four parts, actually. It's not one thing. The first part is self-awareness. Do you know what you're feeling, how those feelings are shaping your perceptions and thoughts and impulse to act? Are you mindful, in other words? The second part is managing those emotions, particularly the turbulent ones, but also your passions, the positive ones, marshaling the sensibility that helps you be at your best, that helps you be on, and capping really the emotions that throw you off, extreme anger, anxiety, for example. Then there's also, and this is really important for leaders and for coaches, empathy. It's the third part. Being able to tune into other people, to know what they're feeling, to sense those feelings without their telling you in words. People rarely tell you in words that, it's picking up facial expressions and nonverbal cues. And then the fourth part is really managing relationships effectively. And that requires you pull together all of that because first you have to lead yourself before you can lead other people. If you're out of control, then you're not going to be able to help other people. And actually, as I think about it, a lot of the abilities that make someone a good leader also make someone a good coach.
That's such a comprehensive definition and really speaks to a lot of what we've been exploring in terms of that human-centric approach to leadership and the ability to connect and understand and recognize emotions in others, but to manage yourself. And I'm also curious, before we get stuck in more deeply, whether you feel that the notion of emotional intelligence has changed in the years since you kind of initially brought it onto the public radar.
Well, my model has changed. In my first book, I talked about motivation as a part of emotional intelligence. Now I see that as self-management. motivating yourself. So I have 4 parts before I had 5. I think it's a minor difference. I've also looked more deeply into the competencies that are based on these abilities of emotional intelligence that make someone an outstanding performer. I've noticed, for example, in surveys of companies, when they say, well, what do you want from coaches? They're basically asking for help with an executive's emotional intelligence in one way or another. They may not call it emotional intelligence. This is something else that's happened. It's become so widespread. It's actually embedded in the DNA of many organizations. So they use their own language. They may talk about executive presence instead of self-awareness or empathy. But when you unpack those terms, you're talking about emotional intelligence. And of course, there are many, many different schools of thought, many different people who are teaching different aspects of emotional intelligence. So that's probably something new. There's a mini industry there. My own emotional intelligence course looks at the 12 competencies of outstanding performers that are based on emotional intelligence. And I think these are extremely important for a coach to know about, because you may be called in to help with, adaptability, flexibility, being agile. Well, that actually is an aspect of emotional intelligence. Or having a drive to get better and better, to achieve, but not only achieve, to learn consistently how to do better. That's another competence of emotional intelligence. So what I'm saying is that coaches may be brought in to help an executive with a problem that is called in the culture of this organization X, but if you unpack it, they're really asking for emotional intelligence.
To see it in so many diverse forms, but at the crux, at the heart of it, it's all likely flowing back into the concept of emotional intelligence. Is that something that now is prevalent? Does the notion of a need to focus on emotional intelligence exist in all businesses? Or are there still some that are maybe looking at a more kind of clinical approach to how they're operating?
It varies very much from organization to organization and from leader to leader, depending on whether they recognize the importance of these human qualities. Let's not call it emotional intelligence. Let's say it's being an effective leader. What is it that makes an effective leader? Well, very interesting. When you're in school, you hear a lot about cognitive abilities, IQ. Statistically, IQ predicts income over a lifetime. But the reason it predicts income is it can tell you whether or not you can get an advanced degree. That's what predicts the income. And if you get an MBA, which is an advanced degree, and you start working with other people who have the same background academically, it turns out IQ no longer matters. What differentiates outstanding performers, outstanding leaders, is their human qualities, how they manage themselves, how they tune into other people, how they manage a group, their direct reports, their team. That's what makes someone outstanding, and that's based on emotional intelligence. It's not your IQ. IQs are about the same.
For me is almost this incredible full circle. One of the first concepts I learned about in entering the workforce in the late 90s and becoming a leader was this notion that emotional intelligence often matters a great deal more than IQ. And, here at the later phases of my career, I am returning to that very much from the coaching perspective and understanding how much of my career journey and the career journeys of those people I work with, the excellent cultures I've had the opportunity to experience, and those where there's been some fundamental challenges or need for improvement, usually come back to that notion of emotional intelligence. And I think one of the phrases that many people will be familiar with is that people tend not to leave a job, they tend to leave a manager. I'm not going to call them a leader deliberately in that, or to leave a boss.
Yeah.
How true is that in your experience?
Yeah, I think that the data shows that if you ask people in exit interviews or after they've left the company, why did you really leave? Well, it wasn't the pay. It wasn't the demands of the job. I just couldn't stand working for that jerk. You hear that over and over and over again. And people get promoted to leadership positions for all kinds of reasons. Not because of emotional intelligence per se, for many politics of the organization, whatever it may be, which means that there's a great unevenness among executives in these human abilities, in their actual capacity to be emotionally intelligent, which coaches should be grateful for, because that's why they call you in.
Absolutely. So it then sends us in the direction of, What does it mean to be an effective leader in terms of having good emotional intelligence? What are some of the hallmarks that a leader should have who is emotionally intelligent?
In research that I've been involved with, the most effective climate among people who are reporting to a leader is created by a leader who's inspiring, who can articulate a mission, a shared purpose that resonates. It's from the heart to the heart. Resonates personally for that leader, and it hits people. It's a bullseye for them too. And then the reason this is so powerful is that you get the very best out of people. They're not just working for the money. They're not just working for promotion. They're working because they believe in what they're doing. And people will absolutely give their best effort for that. So that's very important. The worst kind of leader, by the way, you didn't ask, but I'll tell you.
Oh, please.
is often someone who was an outstanding individual performer. And that's why they got promoted to a leadership position. But when they're bad, they tend to be bad because they're perfectionists. And the problem with a perfectionist is that they only focus on what's wrong, not what's right. And they're very self-critical. They drive themselves to do better and better and better, which looks good. But then when they become a leader, they lead the same way. They see their people in terms of what they did wrong, not what they're doing right. And they give terrible feedback. They're highly critical, highly judgmental, and it is very demotivating for people. So this type of leadership in our data actually turns out to be the worst.
I look back through my career and can think of many examples which would support exactly what you've spoken there. And you've seen many more leaders than I. And there is this almost incredible juxtaposition of the empathetic, the compassionate, the inspiring leader. I think communication is something also that we have explored in this series. The leader who is able to bring people on a journey, even when it's a difficult one. It could be the business is being restructured or there is some significant kind of change afoot, versus the leader who is very focused on the bottom line or meeting the business imperatives or following a strategy. And that does then erode the human aspects of the team. And that can often kind of play out in negative consequences for both the, say, health and well-being of the team in terms of stress, in terms of motivation to do their work, their work-life balance potentially, but also in terms of the impact to the business. So when we kind of think about that kind of context of how the leader can set the tone of a team in a direction, should businesses be hiring for good emotional intelligence? Or should they be working to develop it, or maybe a bit of both?
I think it's easier for an organization to help people develop further strengths. Bring in a coach, for example, than to spot emotional intelligence when someone is applying for a job. The reason is you want to look your best when you're applying for a job. And many or maybe most of the measures that are used to screen people for emotional intelligence are self-report measures. And people can game those. So I think it's a smarter business strategy to hire people for whatever expertise the job requires, and then to offer them a way to get better at self-awareness and managing themselves, leading themselves, or empathize, whatever it may be that the person needs. I think it's better to help train or develop those abilities than to try to hunt them out in the first place.
I recall reading in your book, your original book, many years ago, that there were no tests for emotional intelligence. Now, that very much could have changed in the intervening years, and maybe I should start first in asking if that's still the case.
No, I would say there might be too many tests for emotional intelligence, each of which is based on a slightly different version of what's meant by emotional intelligence. And you have to remember that, these are commercial efforts, and people are trying to sell a test, and it may or may not be actually a good one. I think that the strategy of having a coach train and develop for a person's particular limits is better than using a test.
So we're working then in a situation where it's very individual. It's based on an individual's experience and individual's competencies, and that can be developed through coaching. Are there other tools that you would kind of point to as being effective to helping to either focus on emotional intelligence or make someone a more effective user of their EI?
Yeah, there are two things I'd like to suggest. One is called the Daniel Goleman Emotional Intelligence. It's an online program. You can get it from, I think, Key Step Media, one word, Key Step Media. And it gives you an in-depth understanding of the dozen or so basic competencies that matter in the workplace that are based on emotional intelligence. And then if you're coaching, there's something called the Emotional and Social Competence Inventory, which is a 360, and it evaluates the whole spectrum of emotional intelligence, all those competencies, for example, and it gives you a baseline. It actually is designed only for leadership development, not for assessment of a broad range of people to pick someone, but rather, where is this executive now? What is this executive good at and not so good at, as seen by people the executive chooses because he or she knows these people, they know him or her. You trust that person. You want to know what they think. And the evaluators evaluate anonymously, so they can be very frank. So this gives you great baseline data. It's like if you go to the doctor for a physical and you get your readout of a profile of your lipids and your cholesterol and so on. These are different data points. So the coach gets different data points and can look at that with the executive and say, well, I see you're good at this and good at that. People who know you well say you could get better at this. Let's focus on that. And then the coach, of course, needs to use this as news to use rather than many people take it as a judgment. Oh my God, I've seen this terrible. That's not the point. The point is you can improve there and you'd be a better leader. And then you can give that same thing when you're after a good amount of coaching, half year, a year, or whatever, and have the same raters evaluate them, and the person can see how they have improved. I think that's very important. That's the Emotional and Social Competence Inventory. I think Korn Ferry is a consultancy that handles that.
I had the great fortune, though maybe it didn't feel so at the time, of actually having that emotional and social competency report about 10 years ago. So I was about halfway through my corporate career. And I say that, at the time it was rather sobering because it was a report that highlighted my strengths, and it certainly highlighted areas that I needed to focus on. And some of them were blind spots, which is where I think the pain of reflection comes in. So it's almost ironic that something that is there to help you increase your emotional intelligence is often perceived as something negative, because as humans, we can react to that negative feedback.
Simone, I think this is why it's very important that the feedback be given by a coach, someone who's seasoned, who can frame it in a way where this is not a negative judgment of you. This is rather information for you to help you see where to focus your efforts. Let's look at it that way. In other words, you want to put it in a more positive frame for the person and then use it as information that will get them where they want to go.
I think that's such an important message, Dan, because I think of that is that at the time, it did feel difficult. It was wonderful to read the positive aspects and to have, the kind of the verbatim feedback, but some of it was a surprise. And I'm very grateful I did it, but it did feel that way on the day. And that rating by those who know and care for you and have that level of intimacy, I think is a really helpful piece. So us keeping in mind that it's a positive framework for feedback is a great reminder to the leaders who are maybe thinking of using various 360 feedback tools. And that then kind of leads me to ask them the more pointed question is, how can feedback help to develop emotional intelligence in leaders?
Well, I think feedback is essential because no matter what you're learning, including emotional intelligence, you want to know where I'm good, where I've done enough, where I'm seen as sufficient and actually operating well. And then you want to focus on what I still need to improve on. What do I have to learn? This is true in any field, particularly true when a coach is helping an executive.
It's the thinking about that kind of development as a trajectory. And you mentioned earlier in our discussion about how often it's individual contributors who have been prized for their ability perhaps to deliver or for being deep subject matter experts. And we actually have an episode where we explore that concept a bit with Rachel Hanley-Brown, which is really pertinent to this as well. But then there's often a skill gap in terms of transitioning into a leader role. In those scenarios, Should businesses be thinking about how they can actively develop emotional intelligence as part of any new leadership transition?
I think it should be universal, because leadership is about emotional intelligence. It's all about how you manage people, how you guide them, how you influence. By the way, I feel that coaching and mentoring is part of leadership. I think a coach models for an executive how to coach their direct reports. This is very important. So I think that a company would do well, and in fact, we have data about this, a company would do well to do whatever it can to help its leaders, and its new leaders particularly, get their game up on emotional intelligence, because that's what leadership is about. And by the way, so many people get promoted to a leadership position who haven't been in one, and they need help. How do I do this now? It's a different skill set. There's that saying, what got you here won't get you there. What got you promoted is not going to help you be good at now being a leader. And so companies need to do it. That's why I'm very happy to have this. I mentioned the Daniel Goleman Emotional Intelligence course. It could be used for leaders too, for new leaders, as well as for coaches. I did mention that you can get CEU credits through ICF. I don't know if it's okay to mention ICF.
It is.
Here.
Yeah.
But I think you get 41 credits if you do this course as a coach. But, credits apart, I think it just would help a coach understand the nature of this absolutely essential skill set for leadership.
I think if I reflect on my kind of mentoring and leadership discussions as a leader, but then the work I've been doing as a coach over recent years, so much of what I see and so many of my clients are actually bringing issues and opportunities that are rooted in some depth of emotional intelligence. And often the areas where they find their greatest reward in working with others, whether it's their team, their leader, or they have peers, is based on those more human connections where someone has had some kind of a breakthrough or they've helped someone to solve a problem. I think of that context of my early days as a leader. There was almost no room for emotion. You had to be very kind of poised. And when you are promoted into a leadership position, it's usually a reward for a certain set of behaviors, as we spoke about already. But there may not have been the openness and the connection that often fosters these really emotionally kind of rich relationships based in trust that make people successful. Is there a role? Should there be a role for true emotion at work and kind of those deep connections?
Simone, there always has been. The brain does not distinguish between work and the rest of life. Every thought is emotionally valenced. Everything we do carries an emotional message as well as explicit, whatever else we're trying to communicate. When I wrote the book Emotional Intelligence, people told me, you can't use the word emotion in a business. As you said, it wasn't allowed. But the fact was, people were suppressing all the time what their feelings were. It wasn't that they weren't feeling anything. They were always feeling something. So it's not that we need to be emotional and expressive of our emotions, but just acknowledge that emotions are at work with everybody. And, in research at Yale, for example, this is really important. They found that if the leader of a team was in a negative mood, people on the team would catch that mood and performance would go down. If the leader was in an upbeat mood, like this is great, let's really do this, everybody else caught that mood, performance went up. So emotions are contagious, and they're most contagious from the leader outward. It's very important. It's not like emotions don't exist here or don't matter. They do matter. They matter enormously.
I wish we'd had this conversation 25 years ago, but it's great to be having it now. And that, I think, is one of the challenges that many newer leaders, whether they're early in their career or they're new to leadership after having perhaps decades of experience, we're trying to help to bring to life within this series, is that those human qualities really make you an exceptional leader and distinguish from some maybe more traditional and, as you said, kind of buttoned up ways of doing it. And I was casting my mind back, and I actually pulled out my old copy of your first book, Emotional Intelligence. And there was a quote in there that I'd underlined in pencil probably when I was about 25. It said, self-awareness is a neural mode that maintains self-effectiveness even amidst turbulent emotions. And, I think of the many, many, many experiences where either I've let myself react emotionally or others have, either with anger or despair or maybe jubilation, which is always a good thing. But we have just reacted in the spur of the moment in our very natural and human way. But often that isn't internalized or maybe digested in a way, so self-awareness might be lacking. Are there methods or tools that leaders can help their team, or a coach could help a leader to help them understand more of their self-awareness and kind of recognize?
Lately, I've been very interested in mindfulness as a tool for coaches, for business. My wife, Tara Bennett Goleman, wrote a book, Emotional Alchemy. It was the first book to combine psychotherapy and mindfulness. And basically what it's about is learning the pause. That is, if you look at the sequence from the event that made you so exhilarated or so upset, something's happening in the brain. You have a certain kind of perception, you have certain kinds of thoughts which lead to an action. And it's very often that action which people in retrospect regret. I called it an emotional hijack in the book. And the question is, can you learn to be more mindful? Can you learn to pause before you act? And the answer is obviously yes, you can if you try and if you make it a habit. And I think that is a tool that anyone can use in their life and at work, and any leader, any executive, so that you don't do things that you're going to regret the next moment. You don't blow up at the person. You may channel your anger in a more effective way, for example.
So using mindfulness to help us self-regulate and to be more mindful as well to our response. And certainly when you're looking at your competencies and your behaviors, understanding more about your triggers and your default reactions must be a really important part of that process. These are complex skills, or at least layered considered responses on top of the emotional reaction or emotional hijacking that's happening there. Are there ways that when we have reacted in a way that is inappropriate, that we can, I guess, self-soothe, to kind of speak back to the concept, but also how we can repair damage done in the heat of the moment?
I think there are two directions this goes in. One is managing yourself, which is resilience. Resilience technically is the time it takes you to recover from the peak of the emotion back to how you were, the calm previously. And the more resilient you are, the more equanimity you'll have, and the better you'll be able to do the next thing, which is think about, oh my God, I said that to so-and-so. What do I do now? And you probably apologize. In other words, you have to mend the relationship somehow if you feel you've damaged it.
That's such a human response. If we fight with our spouse or a friend or a sibling, it's the same situation here as you would experience at work. And I guess some of the best cultures are those that acknowledge that there might be those human situations, that failure is acceptable, that sometimes we don't get it right. And understanding how you react is, of course, a key part of that. But the notions of resilience is is an interesting one and has again come up quite a few times within the series. Resilience can often be in short supply when people are stressed, or there are challenges or a difficult environment or difficult relationships particularly. How closely should resilience and something like empathy and compassion, how do they connect?
Well, let's talk first about stress and resilience, because I think it's a very important point. The workplace is full of stresses. Even the best place to work is full of stresses. Life is stress. And too often in modern life, we just assume that someone can handle stress after stress, but the truth is that can lead to emotional exhaustion and to burnout. What I strongly recommend is people schedule daily a session for themselves to recover. And by recovery, I mean physiological recovery, because stress activates the fight or flight response, sympathetic nervous system response. The body, the central nervous system, is designed to have recovery periods after fight or flight. in modern life, we don't allow for that. So I'm saying make it an important priority enough that you would have a daily session. And it might be yoga. It might be a walk in nature. It might be meditation. It has to be something that gets your mind off the thing that's the stress. Because you can wake up at 2 a.m. as stressed as you were when you were at work because you're thinking about it. So find something you can do, which is actually recovery, playing with a pet, whatever it might be, and do it daily. Make it important in your list of to-dos because it's going to help you go back into that fray. That's how to build in resilience. And then the question is about, I think you're really talking about compassion. What does a leader do when someone loses it, when they get angry and so on? Well, I think it's important you don't dismiss the person as, he's a hothead, she's like that. But see what you can do. Remember, coaching and mentoring is part of leadership. What can you do to help that person next time around?
Those are both profound statements for us to kind of reflect behind, building into your daily habit that break to recharge and to regain your equilibrium and therefore your resilience, but also that kind of compassion and understanding that we are humans. You said earlier, which resonates so strongly with me, and I'm sure so many people will have taken that point, is that our minds, our body, we don't distinguish between work and leisure. It's life. So we are often in points of stress or emotionally charged or difficult moments. And one of the challenges I think we've seen, particularly through the pandemic and the years that have followed now, is that greater awareness of people's individual circumstances and personal situations. There will be conflicts at home. There might be bereavement. There might be difficulties in childcare or caring. And it is really vital for us in a way to acknowledge that. So empathy and compassion are critical towards supporting someone within that. But how can a leader work to build bridges, either because they don't exist because of a new relationship or because there has been damage through a less strong relationship, so that someone can surface those things that may be going on for them outside of the formal work environment that are potentially very real and very pressingly influencing what's happening for them at work?
This is a key point. I think the answer is take an interest in that person. In other words, I'm thinking, for example, of an incident that we reported in our book, Optimal, where an employee had lodged a complaint with a federal agency that meant that work had to stop and there'd be an investigation. And the executive in charge of that employee didn't blow his top at that employee. Instead, actually, it was a woman. She got together with the employee and asked a lot of questions. What's going on with you? What's happening in your life? And she found out that this woman who lodged the complaint, her husband had cancer, and she was having trouble with the insurer, the company insurer, getting coverage for his treatments. And that was really what was going on with her. That was why she had this grudge and lodged a complaint. And then the executive did things that helped her husband get the coverage he needed. It wasn't that hard, but she made an extra effort, and then they withdrew the complaint. So basically what I'm saying here is that ask questions. Find out what's actually going on. Don't do a knee-jerk response from your assumptions beforehand, but get to know the person. Very often, it's important for an executive to have a one-on-one connection with the people that they report for, particularly someone new. And that one-on-one connection is not about the job, it's about the person. What do you want from life? What do you want from this job? How can I help you? In other words, these are things that build a bridge and that may take a little time, but they make things work much, much better.
I'm so heartened to hear you say that. And I hope so many of the listeners will take that to heart. I reflect back on my years as a leader. And now that I, largely work for myself or with others within that coaching capacity, it's actually the team that I miss. It's the individuals, it's the connection. But it does take time, and it takes that kind of human, authentic approach. And we won't all love everyone. Yeah, there will always be kind of conflict and challenges within the way, but you over time build those relationships, and they're likely the cornerstone of every effective team. You mentioned earlier how moods are contagious. How can leaders attune to their teams to see what's happening and kind of gauge the mood when they're also walking that maybe quite pressured line of delivering the results, with the focus on having things done at any cost from maybe their leaders as well?
Yeah. Well, a leader in that position is under terrific pressure because you've got to, meet the mark. And at the same time, you need to attend to the people on your team as people. We found, for example, in the book Optimal, we start with some research that was done at Harvard Business School, where people kept a journal of their day at work. They had, thousands of journals they analyzed. They found the optimal state was one when people were great performers. They performed at their best. They were engaged in their work. They really loved what they were doing. They felt really good. They loved who they're doing it with. And it turned out that emotionally intelligent leaders created that. And I think the way such a leader creates it is by relating to the team and to the person with their heart as a person as best they can. And it's not that it's very interesting about motivation. If you say to a team, we've got to get X, that's what we're being held to here, that actually is not a positive motivator. The positive motivator is remember what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it matters that we do it really well. That's the inspiring lead. And these are two very different motivational systems, and they have different impacts on the brain of the person receiving that. The one where there's the dire threat, we have to make it, closes people down, and the other one opens them up.
You've mentioned the inspiring leader so many times through the course of the conversation. What are the hallmarks of someone who's inspiring?
I think the first measure is that they actually care themselves. And the second is that they can articulate what it is they care about to other people in a way that resonates with those people. I think those are maybe the two hallmarks of such leaders.
Is that something a coach could support a leader in developing?
Yeah, I think that a coach, for example, could help a leader rehearse what it is they want to say. A coach can help a leader get in touch with what matters to them. And I think that knowing that is the beginning of being able to inspire.
One of the topics that we explore is introversion and how in some leaders, they are not as comfortable in being vulnerable or speaking with a great depth of passion because it's just not their kind of default approach within that. But as you kind of speak to there, inspiration is largely about communication, and it is something that you can learn and you can build. So I guess there's not one size fits all for being the inspiring leader. Well, there are different paths to it.
Sure. And I think one of the things you see among such leaders is they often will tell personal stories about their lives, stories about what inspired them or what mattered to them. You don't have to be totally self-disclosing. People who you're calling introverts might be uncomfortable with full, total self-disclosure. But you want to think about what mattered to you and what matters about what you're doing to you. And how can you talk about that in a way that's going to matter to the person who's listening.
So it's authenticity. It doesn't have to be great vulnerability.
No.
But it is that kind of approachability and that kind of genuine connection. I think back to one of my favorite leaders who was quite introverted and was very upfront about that the more emotional side of things was something that was less accessible to them, but led with ensuring that we understood that this was an area of development and that feedback would be welcome, but tried very transparently to cultivate that. And over time, it built trust and created a great sense of closeness. So, practical example of that working.
Simone, I think that's a very important point, that the person who was working to develop something can be very open about it and say, I don't think I'm that good at empathy and I'm trying to get better at it. Help me out. That creates, I think, a lot of sympathy, and people do want to help you out.
That's the importance of feedback again.
It's an invitation for feedback. Instead of communicating that I don't want to hear about it, I'm going to criticize you or blame you or punish you if you give me feedback. Rather, it's saying, I welcome it. Thank you. You're helping me get better.
Yeah, and I think through my career as it progressed, and this is less about time working, but possibly also the period we all exist within, speaking about this here in 2024, there is, I think, a greater humanity that is supported and celebrated, and is the kind of depth of relationship, the common ground is celebrated in a lot of businesses where they have a strong culture, from small businesses, startups, to huge multinationals. And that focus on culture hopefully has a kind of foundation in emotional intelligence. Is culture something that you have kind of considered? What role does that play?
Well, I think the culture is the larger frame for whether or not this ability set is valued, whether it's modeled, whether it's implicit in everything we do. And it may be that some cultures which don't particularly say we like emotional intelligence are emotionally intelligent anyway, without using that language. I don't think the language is important. I think it's the behavior that's important. And do we value people as people here? That's the key question.
That then sparks something in me, is that when you are maybe working in an environment where there is a leader who has a very strong sense of emotional intelligence, but they might be working in a framework where that is less recognized and important, does it matter?
Well, the odds are it does, and I'll tell you why. Because the emotionally intelligent leader is more likely to get the best out of people and therefore have the better performance. So the black box is, how did you get that performance? But inside is the active ingredient is emotional intelligence.
If you think about a lack then of emotional intelligence in a business, what are the implications? What are the tangible and less tangible implications where emotional intelligence is weak?
You named it before. It's one of the things that breeds is toxic leaders. Leaders people don't want to work for, and leaders people leave. So turnover would be one index of it. And odds are, all things being equal, and they never are in a business setting, but all things being equal, that outfit would have poorer performance because people would be demotivated. So those are two markers.
And if people are demotivated, their productivity is lower, and the yield may be. So there's a cascade of consequences there. And I guess you also will see that often in businesses going through transition, maybe changes of leaders or a takeover. So that is a rock that should be looked under for teams that are not performing.
I would agree with you. And I'd say that, it's very tricky when a company is taken over by another company, which means a culture is taking over another culture, and a way of doing things is taking over another way of doing things, that in that transition, it turns out that the people who lead that transition do better if they're empathic, if they listen to people, if that helps them make decisions that are better. And that's actually a sign of emotional intelligence. So I'd say that the leader of that new organization, if that leader has emotional intelligence, it probably will go better.
Yeah. That's that kind of top-down cascade, and when hopefully in those scenarios, like recognizes like, and those people who have that deeper competency in navigating some of the or all of the behaviors of emotional intelligence, then are maybe able to bring that to bear, and hopefully then it's transformative in those situations across the whole business.
That's the best scenario. Thank you, Simone.
Let's hope for everyone. And just, thinking about also changes. We're working in arguably a very exciting time, but with a great deal of uncertainty. There's incredible new technology on the rise, not the least of which is artificial intelligence. How important is emotional intelligence in the face of artificial intelligence? And do they coexist? Is there friction? What's the prognosis?
I think that they coexist. People often say, well, emotional intelligence matter because of AI. I think that emotional intelligence always matters in leadership and always will matter in leadership. And as AI comes into more workplaces and becomes part of jobs, we'll adjust to that. But I don't think it will replace emotional intelligence. AI doesn't have feelings. has no self-awareness, has no self-management of feelings. It can mimic emotional intelligence, but it isn't emotionally intelligent.
This is a really important for as coaches and you as a thought leader within this space, but also for businesses thinking about how they can optimize performance or potentially save costs or innovate, that there are many incredible capabilities of AI, but the human ones are possibly not where we should be focusing our energies at this point.
Well, you talk about innovation, you talk about inspiration, you talk about leadership, talk about coaching. All of that, I think, requires a live human being.
That's where that emotional byplay comes in, and that empathy, the compassion, the conversation is the key. And that makes me wonder a little bit about thinking about coaches. Coaches, as well as leaders, but coaches in this context, can often bear quite a significant emotional load because they are supporting potentially a client who may or may not be leading a team and having deeper context there. How can coaches keep up their, let's say, emotional resilience rather than just the intelligence?
Yeah, I think coaches need self-care too. They take on a lot from clients, and remember that scheduling a recovery in every day, I think that's as important for coaches as for anyone else.
Yeah, we'd have to make sure we schedule that time, and I'm definitely going to be better as a consequence of this conversation. A happy one. One of the things you also write about in your books is how we should consider we should use our emotional intelligence effectively in considering our career and recognizing how we feel about what we do. And given that work can be a very emotionally charged space, how should anyone be thinking about their career and kind of checking that against how it is making them feel?
Well, I think that's such a good point. Over the course of your career, you'll have many choices. Should I do this or that? Should I stay with this job or go to another job? And I think how you feel about it is actually how you make that decision.
So it becomes a barometer for us.
It always is.
Yeah.
Yes. There's very good research on that. The part of the brain that registers our life experience doesn't talk to the part of the brain that thinks in words. It speaks directly to the GI tract. We get a gut feeling. Trust your gut feeling.
That, I think, is such an important direction for all of us because often we almost coach ourselves out of exactly that, is that we can overthink things. Of course, anyone can. But often that gut reaction is that signpost of something needing deeper thought. When you have a strong emotional reaction to something beyond the gut instinct, is that something we should be paying attention to at work?
Well, you ask yourself, why am I having that reaction? What is it about it? Your body is trying to tell you something. It's not that it overrules all the other data points, but it's data too. Listen to it.
I've been so inspired by this conversation, Dan. There are so many great reflections and tools that you've shared with us today. I'm going to ask you a final one, and that's, what's your kind of one pearl of wisdom for leaders who are on that leadership journey today?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that there's just one thing. In this Daniel Goleman Emotional Intelligence course, we talk about 12 things.
Okay.
Depending on the person. But I would say, think about what inspires you to keep going.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Dan, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you today and to have you join us on this journey as we explore what it means to be a more human-centric leader. Where's the best place for people to go to learn about the incredible work that you're doing?
Oh, well, it's really summarized in this online program. I mentioned the Daniel Goleman Emotional Intelligence Program, and you can go to my website, danielgoleman.info. But I think this program at Key Step Media really puts it in a way where it's news to use. It's designed to help you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful to speak to you today.
You too, Simone. Really a pleasure. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, signature programs, member benefits, interviews, podcasts like this one, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.